Today we are talking about the Natasha Denona Glam Face palette in the shade Light. This is not a new palette, not a new release. I just picked it up recently, so it's new to my collection. And because I already have the Glam Face Dark palette, I would actually like to do a little bit of comparison between the two palettes, explain why I decided to pick up the light version of this palette, and then of course do a little demo with the eyeshadows as well as the blush and the highlighter. Just in case you're not familiar with this concept, let me quickly explain it. About half a year ago, Natasha Denona released these Glam Face and Eye palettes, which contain, let me put the little protecting lid here, both a blush and a highlighter, as well as 5 eyeshadows which lean more in her neutral tones. Now, the 2 face powders are protected by this little plastic flap, and then the blush is actually more of like a cream powder formula. And the texture and the formula of the highlighter actually very much reminds me of Golden Nectar from Pat McGrath. It's this very light, very silky, very flattering on the skin looking powder. And for those of you who have been around my channel, you know that I picked up the dark version of this palette pretty much upon its release because I was very intrigued by these. I very much enjoyed the tones of the eyeshadows in the dark palette as well as the tone of the blush because it leans more on like that terracotta brick side, which I very much enjoy. Now, I really still do very much like this palette. I love it, in fact, so much that I decided to pick up the light version of it because 2 reasons. First of all, when these were marketed, I thought that we're getting eyeshadows in Natasha Denona's like regular formula, so we're just going to get a few mattes and a few metallic shades. What I didn't realize is that these 2 eyeshadows, the 2 metallic shades, are in what is probably going to be Natasha Denona's most special kind of formula, because it is a formula that I've only ever seen featured once in her palettes, and that was the gold palette. There are 2 eyeshadows in there, one more specifically like a beige neutral brown shade, which has a formula that makes your eyelids look like glass. They have that wet lid effect. They're definitely not a regular metallic eyeshadow. And when I picked up this palette, I was so pleasantly surprised to find out that both of these eyeshadows come in that gorgeous glass metallic wet formula. And this shade in particular is one of the most beautiful neutral shades that I've ever seen. It has slightly warm base, but then the overlay is this beautiful like silver taupe metallic glitter to it, and it just looks absolutely fabulous on the lids. However, over the course of using this palette, I found myself sometimes longing for somewhat brighter, lighter in tone metallic shades, because while these are gorgeous, they're quite deep in tone, so what you get as a result of that is a pretty smoky eye look. And of course, this palette was not meant for someone of my skin tone. The light version of this palette exists because that was meant for my skin tone. The dark version was meant of people with a darker skin tone. But I was just so attracted to the tones, and especially that metallic taupe shade, that I could not resist it. However, over the course of time and over the course of using it, and especially now with the more summer months when you want something a little bit lighter on your lids, I was really longing for this specific formula, but then with lighter tones. And I decided that because I have found myself thinking about purchasing the lighter version of this palette for quite a few months now, and because of the presence of these 2 formulas here, like I said, the more like special Natasha Denona metallic shades, and the fact that I could find this eyeshadow palette secondhand, almost unused, for half off, were a combination of reasons that led me to the decision to actually purchase this palette, because I think I'm really going to enjoy it. And when I received it, I think that it looks even more beautiful in person, because this shade in particular, I don't know whether you can see it a little bit on camera, but in photos it looks really boring, but in real life it looks like the most beautiful like light rose gold ever, and I cannot wait to put it on my lids. Now let me try to hold the 2 palettes for you next to each other so that you can see a little bit the differences in their tones. The deeper version is much warmer in tone, I feel like, whereas the lighter version leans from neutral to maybe even more cool toned, and it doesn't really have that many like really warm toned eyeshadows, so I think these 2 are also going to pair together really well. The first thing that we're going to do is swatch these 2 palettes side by side, and the first products that I'm going to swatch are the 2 blushes. So I'm going to swatch the light here on the bottom and the deep over top of that, so we can compare. Alright, so they are indeed quite, you know, different from each other, and one is obviously much deeper. This is indeed more of like a terracotta brick with quite a little bit of pink in it, whereas this one almost leans to like a peachy pink shade. Let's swatch the two highlighters, and I can already see from the pan that the deeper one is definitely, of course, a little bit deeper. So here you have the light, here you have the deep. Let's watch the light first. And over top, let's watch the deep. I can pull off the deep just about. It is a beautiful like coppery peachy shade, which I really like. This seems more of your like typical champagne beige. Again, even from the Too Faced products, you can already tell these ones from the dark palette are much warmer in tone, whereas these two I think are a bit cooler in tone. So both of these palettes sort of have the same layout in the sense that they have a shade that is called Smoke, Outer Corner, Crease, Transition and Inner Corner, and I'm going to swatch each corresponding shade from the two palettes above each other. So let's start with the Transition shade, because that would typically be the shade that you start your look off with. And again, much more neutral, almost cooler in tone, much warmer in tone. So here you have the light palette and here you have the dark version of it. You can see immediately this has so much more pink and cooler tones to it compared to this, which is much more orange. The next shadow I want to swatch is the shade Crease, because obviously after Transition you would go into your crease. A very obvious difference in the depth. This is the light, this is the dark. This is already quite much darker, so you can see this is actually much more neutral in tone compared to all these, to both of these other shades. I think this is a really beautiful like neutral brown. I'm actually very curious how that crease shade from Natasha Denona compares to Statuesque from Pat McGrath. So I'm going to do like a little extra swatch right here. I'm going to put Statuesque right here. Wow, okay, you can see that they're actually not that different from each other, but Statuesque is slightly cooler in tone compared to the shade from Natasha Denona. Alright, next up we have the shade Smoke, which will be your like outer corner deepening shade. Again, the one in the dark palette is a really deep brown. Let's see, I'm going to swatch this. I'm going to swatch the light eyeshadow right here and the deep right here. And now let's swatch the metallic shades. I'm going to first do the outer corner shades, which are quite different in tone when you compare the two palettes. This is the light, this is the dark. So it is a highlighter. Yeah. So here we have the rose gold shade from the light palette, and here we have, sorry, Nicola is here. And here we have the more like coppery red brown from the dark palette. Quite a dramatic difference in their tones. And finally, let's compare the inner corner shades. And here you have my favorite shade from the dark palette, which is this gorgeous sort of like taupey metallic brown shade, and underneath that you have much more like your typical pink golden champagne shade. So here are comparison swatches between the dark and light face and eye glam palettes from Natasha Denona. On top you have the dark, on the bottom you have the light version. I've zoomed you in a little bit. I hope that these comparison swatches were useful to you, and without further ado I'm going to jump into creating a look with the light palette. I'm going to first apply the blush and then the highlighter, and finally we're going to jump into the eyeshadow. I quite like this blush formula because it's very reminiscent of the melting powder blushes from Suku, but just slightly more waxy. This is like a really beautiful, like translating sort of like a warm pink on my skin. I feel like it's the kind of pink that I would still wear. I am more likely to wear a pink like this than like a cooler Barbie pink type of shade. This is actually quite pretty. And now let's apply the highlighter, which I already know from experience with the dark palette is a really gorgeous formula. Oh, and this is also really pretty. I think it fits my skin tone really well because it really lifts my cheekbones, and I don't think it really leaves a cast. I think it's just an absolutely gorgeous highlight. Okay, wow. Moi. Nicola is here pretty much drowning his face in powder. So here you have the two face products. I was already familiar with the formula, so I knew that the formula would not be an issue, but I was curious how the two tones are going to work on me, and I think they look pretty nice. So today, for totally random reasons, I'm just going to do a look with the crease shade, the smoke shade, and then I'm going to put the two metallic shades on my lid and inner corner just to see how that works out, and I'm going to leave the transition shade to another time. I'm taking a fluffy crease blending brush and I'm going to go into the shade Crease. He made a mess in my drawer. I'm sorry guys, the toddler is really distracting me. He's rubbing my sponges onto his feet. Alright, proceeding with fluffing a little bit more of that crease shade into my crease. It is really beautiful. I love the tone of it. It's like just the perfect neutral brown. I think he got a bit offended because I yelled at him for spilling powder all over my drawer. Toddlers are apparently very touchy people. He gets upset for the smallest remark you make that is, you know, in a more negative context. Next I'm going to grab a somewhat smaller blending brush and I'm going to go into the shade Smoke and just apply a tiny little bit of that here into the outer corner to deepen it up. Maybe my only criticism of this palette will be that the deepest matte in here is not nearly deep enough to create like a lot of definition, because when I build up that crease shade a bit more, I get pretty much the same tone as I do when I apply the smoke shade. So if you really wanted to use one of these shades as a liner or something to really define your crease, you're going to have to pull out another palette, because this one does not have anything that would work for that. Looking at my outer corner, I think this again leans right on the border between being a neutral and a cool. It's definitely not a warmer tone shade though. I think this is about the most you can get if you build it up in terms of depth, which for me, for like an everyday super easy look, I don't really need more than that. To be honest with you, even in the deep version of this palette, I go into the smoke shade more rarely, just if I really want to define my lash line or my crease. But on most occasions when I reach for this palette, I want to do something quick, easy and brainless, and I don't really reach for the deepest shade anyway. So for me it is not an issue, but just keep it in mind. I'm going to apply a little bit of glitter glue. This is the NYX glitter glue. I typically apply all of my metallic shades that way, so I'm not going to deviate from my SOP. So I'm just going to apply a little bit of that on my lid before we proceed with the two metallic shades. I find that this formula works quite well with a flat shader brush, so this is going to also be my weapon of choice. Usually I would be using my fingers, but I feel like these kind of shades, the metallic wet effect really comes through when you blend them a little bit with a brush. So, well, this shade is really beautiful. It's like a very light rose gold with that gorgeous wet lid effect. It is perfect. This is one of the most perfect light neutral shades I have ever seen. I kept a little bit of my inner corner free to apply the inner corner shade as instructed by Miss Denona. This shade is definitely not very exciting. It still has that gorgeous like wet lid effect, and I think it's going to look really pretty if I would just put like the transition shade, so that lightest matte shade, and this one on the lid. It would make for like a really pretty, super soft look without being boring because of that wet lid effect. But in terms of its tone, this shade is not very unique. I find the rose gold on the lid to be a much more unique tone. I'm also going to take a little bit of the face highlighter again on my flat shader brush and apply it a little bit here on the brow arch as a highlight. And finally I'm going to go into the crease shade, the matte shade that we applied through the crease first, and run that on my lower lash line. Alright, so final thoughts about the Natasha Denona Face Glam palette in the shade Light. I knew what I was getting into, to be honest with you. I had given this quite a lot of thought for at least several months, and I knew that I was getting a lot of use out of the darker version of this palette, which is why I thought I will probably get a lot of use out of this palette. So I think the ultimate test of whether I really truly enjoy this palette a lot will be whether I get as much use out of it as I do with the dark version of this palette, because I knew what I was getting into in terms of the formulas and the textures and what to expect. I do really hope so, because I liked every single powder that I put on my face in here. I liked the cream to powder blush. The highlighter is really gorgeous. I think a really suitable tone for my skin tone. I liked all the eyeshadows that I tried. This shade in particular, the rose gold metallic shade, definitely did not disappoint. It is a really beautiful and unique neutral shade in an absolutely stellar formula. So overall, I am quite pleased with my purchase. I'm really happy to have both of these palettes. Now that the world is also slowly opening up and we can travel a bit more, I can easily imagine myself taking one of these to travel with me. For example, I have a congress upcoming in October, and I've already been thinking about what kind of makeup I would like to take with me, and honestly something like the light version of the Natasha Denona Face Glam palette would be absolutely perfect for that. I think a lot of you probably already have either the light, the dark version, or both versions of these palettes, so I'm very curious what you guys have to say about it. Do you use them a lot? I hope this video was at least a little bit helpful, even if these palettes were already released such a long time ago, and I'm sure you've seen plenty of videos on them. But I thought, you know, I bought the palette as I might as well just give you my 2 cents on it, and I was really curious to do the comparison swatches, and I'm glad to say the two palettes are quite different from each other. They each bring something completely different to the table, with the light version leaning more on like the neutral to cool side, whereas the deeper version houses, I think, much warmer tones in it, and I like both. I think it would be interesting to combine the two palettes. So yeah, overall I think these are beautiful. I think Natasha Denona really knows how to do neutral curations, and if I look through my Natasha Denona eyeshadow palette collection, I only own her like more neutral monochromatic curations, because I think she does those fabulously, and these are an absolutely great example of what she can do really well. So honestly, if it were up to me, I would encourage her to do these types of color stories more, and just add more of these beautiful like reflective formulas to her arsenal, rather than do things like Zendo or the pastel palette or something like that, because I don't know that this is really her forte. But anyway, I went a little bit on a tangent here that nobody asked for. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!